Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Oklahoma. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1903, a time when Oklahoma was still a territory rather than a state. The landscape was wide and restless. Wind sweeping across the prairie, sudden storms blackening the horizon, and lonely farmhouses standing as small islands in the vastness. It was here, on the northern edge of Kay County, that the Harrow family arrived to claim an abandoned house whose title had passed through more than one hand, each owner never lasting long. Their wagon rattled up the dirt track on a late October afternoon. Clouds were already hanging low, and the house, 2 stories tall, clapboard siding long stripped of paint, seemed to retreat into the gloom. Neighbors had warned them not to come. Some did so bluntly, others in hushed tones. "That house breathes," said a shopkeeper in Newkirk. Another muttered, "Best let it rot. It don't want company." The Harrows dismissed such talk. They were practical settlers, willing to take on hardship. The land was fertile, the price had been low, and all official records confirmed the deed's legitimacy. What they did not know, at least not fully, was the troubling history attached to that parcel. County tax ledgers show at least 3 sudden absences. The name Benjamin Kells struck off in 1887, a widow named Frances Lowe vanishing from records by 1892, and a cattle rancher abandoning the site without explanation around 1898. Each time the property sat idle for years, until a new owner tried and failed to hold it. Later testimonies preserved by a county clerk suggest the first impression most visitors had was of air that seemed heavier inside. Moss Thorne, a hired hand who traveled with the Harrows, noted in his journal, "Stepping through the door, I felt as though the walls exhaled a damp wind upon me, not a draft, but a breath." At first, life in the house seemed ordinary enough. Beds were arranged, shutters secured, and meals cooked in the soot-blackened hearth. Yet small peculiarities surfaced almost immediately. The Harrows' youngest child complained that the walls seemed to puff like a chest. Mrs. Harrow wrote to her sister in Kansas, "I tell myself it is timber shifting, or perhaps the wind, but there is a rhythm to it, like lungs." In hindsight, some locals claimed the signs had been there all along. A neighbor, Mrs. Florine Crockett, later told in affidavit, "Even when it stood empty, I would pass by and see curtains draw inward, then push outward, as though the house took in the night and let it out again." These rumors, preserved in scattered clippings and testimonies, formed the foundation of what would become one of Oklahoma's most whispered legends. In fact, around the same period, the Belvedere Mansion in Claremore, completed in 1907, was also gaining a reputation for unexplained sounds and eerie presences, reinforcing a sense that buildings of that era sometimes carried more than just their weight in stone and timber. What began with unease would soon escalate into incidents harder to ignore, and by the winter of 1904, the Harrows household would no longer be spoken of with ordinary pity, but with hushed apprehension, as though something larger than a family misfortune had taken root inside the walls. The first real disturbance recorded in county notes occurred just before Christmas of 1903. The Harrows had settled into a rhythm, hauling water, tending livestock, mending what they could of the sagging house. Yet one evening, as dusk folded into night, a laborer named Amos Thorne went missing for several hours. When he finally returned, he told a confused story, that while searching for firewood near the barn, he felt pulled, as if by a draft, toward the cellar doors. In his statement later given to a local constable, Amos swore he heard the cellar itself give a deep sigh. He described being overcome with dizziness and blacking out near the steps. When he awoke, the lantern he had carried was extinguished, and the doors, though heavy, had swung partly open. His words were written down by Constable Fletcher Wade, who simply noted in the margin, "Strong drink?" But in another line he admitted that no whiskey was found on the man. Inside the house, the Harrows themselves were noticing subtler patterns. Every night, at nearly the same hour, The curtains in the upstairs room stirred inward, though no window was open. Mrs. Harrow placed a candle by her bedside and reported the flame tilting not once but in pulses, as if time to breathe. Her husband, a practical man, suggested faulty construction, hollow walls, or shifting foundations. Yet when neighbors visited, some remarked on the same effect. A newspaper clipping from the Newkirk Republican, dated January 1904, mentions the property obliquely. Strange phenomena said to trouble a northern farmstead. Windows glow without lamp, cattle shy from its fences, no explanation offered. Though the article is brief and avoids names, it reflects that the house's reputation was beginning to spread beyond whispered exchanges. As winter deepened, other stories circulated. A traveling minister, Reverend Horace Bixby, lodged one night, but at the Harrows' request. In later testimony he wrote, "I did not see with my eyes what others claimed, but I heard. A slow inhaling, drawn from the very joists, and a softer release, as though timber and plaster held a weary chest. It was no wind, I know." The Reverend emphasized he did not believe in hauntings, yet his note survives in county archives. By February, unease had turned into avoidance. Neighbors stopped delivering goods directly, leaving them by the roadside instead. Livestock driven past the property balked or broke ranks, requiring extra men to move them. Children in the settlement nearby dared one another to approach the fence at night, claiming they could hear the sleep of the house. It was around this time that the Harrows requested official inspection. A marshal from the territory, Thomas Wade, no relation to Constable Fletcher, arrived with a deputy and a physician. Dr. Lisbeth Monroe was one of the few women practicing medicine in the region, known for her methodical approach. She compared reports of the Harrows house to structural groans noted in other period buildings, even mentioning cases tied to Claremore's Belvedere Mansion, which had gained early notoriety for unexplained creaks and shadows. The team prepared to spend several nights in the house, keeping journals, lanterns, and instruments ready. Their findings, carefully recorded but still ambiguous, would form the backbone of what survives today. Marshal Thomas Wade was known for his sobriety and discipline. His arrival at the Harrow property was noted in the county log as official inquiry, unusual disturbance. He and his deputy carried rifles more out of custom than expectation, while Dr. Monroe brought notebooks, vials, and a barometer. Her aim, she explained, was to record air pressure changes, since so many reports spoke of shifting drafts and breathing. On the first evening, they spread cots across the downstairs parlor. The Harrows kept their distance, retreating upstairs. For several hours the house seemed still. At midnight, however, Wade recorded in his journal a distinct pressure, as if the floor rose beneath me slightly, then relaxed. No tremor, but a flexing. His deputy confirmed the sensation, describing it in plainer words, like standing on a chest. Dr. Monroe measured the air with her instruments and noted subtle fluctuations, pulses that did not match outside winds. She scribbled quietly, unwilling to make premature claims, yet remarked that the effect reminded her of certain structural oddities she had read about in engineering papers. Still, her notes betray unease. No building should produce so steady a rhythm. On the second night, events grew harder to dismiss. The marshal heard what he described as a long exhalation coming from the walls near the cellar door. Lantern flames tilted in unison, without draft. The deputy swore he saw dust motes moving back and forth as though drawn into and expelled from the beams. By the third night, they resolved to enter the cellar. Its doors, heavy oak, bore scratches along the edge, some old, some freshly made. Inside was a cramped chamber, dirt floor uneven, walls reinforced with crude stone. There, beneath loose soil, Wade uncovered fragments, rusted nails, broken glass, a child's shoe nearly rotted. More disturbing was a hollow key into the wall, large enough for a man to crouch within. Within this cavity lay scraps of parchment, half illegible. What could be read suggested medical notes, though crudely phrased. Patient requires air. Keep lungs in motion. Adjust flow. Dr. Monroe examined the scraps by lamplight. Not the work of a physician, she whispered, but someone imitating it. An amateur, perhaps deranged. She folded the fragments into her case. That same night, as they left the cellar, a low vibration seemed to course through the house. Wade described it as not sound, but pressure, like a silent groan pressing against the skin. The deputy, unnerved, refused to sleep indoors thereafter. The Harrows, meanwhile, admitted to their own disturbances, sleepless nights, objects misplaced, children insisting they heard the house sigh. They pleaded with Wade for resolution. He promised further inquiry, though his journal betrays doubt. Cannot advise they remain. The place unsettles men, beasts, and timber alike. Within weeks, word of the marshal's findings circulated in Newkirk. Though no official report was published, rumors of hidden chambers and lungs beneath the house spread quickly. Some whispered that the structure itself had been built upon an older site, perhaps an abandoned dugout or failed well. Others muttered about Benjamin Kells, the vanished settler, experimenting with contraptions meant to mimic breath. By early spring, the Harrows' farm had become a curiosity, yet few dared visit. Those who did claimed to hear a faint inhaling on still nights, like fabric drawing tight. The Harrows lasted through the spring, but their nerves were eroding. Mrs. Harrow's letters to her sister, fragments of which survived in family trunks later discovered in Kansas, describe a household under siege not from intruders, but from the house itself. "The walls seem to breathe," she wrote in April, "and I lie awake as though pressed upon by lungs not my own." Neighbors were keeping records too, though unofficial. A schoolteacher named Edwin Clay compiled anecdotes from his pupils. One boy claimed his father refused to drive cattle past the Harrow farm because animals balked, lowering their heads as if to sense a hidden current. Another child said his older brother threw a stone at the house and swore it was spat back when it landed against his boots. Clay, skeptical but intrigued, noted that the children told their stories without laughter. By May, the house's reputation grew grim. The Newkirk Republican printed another small column. Family in distress on Northern Farmstead. Breathing walls alleged. Marshal Wade visited, found nothing definitive. Locals uneasy. The paper avoided sensational language, but readers spoke of little else. It was during this period that Reverend Horace Bixby, who had earlier lodged for a night, returned to the property with 2 deacons. They hoped prayer might restore calm. The men stayed only until midnight. Later testimony claimed they heard whispering like a sickbed sigh echoing from the rafters. One deacon, Elias Moore, was so unsettled he refused to step indoors again. Bixby himself admitted, "I will not call it demon, but nor will I call it mere air." Marshal Wade, reluctant to reopen an official inquiry, sent his deputy alone to revisit the family in June. The deputy's short report, still preserved in Kay County's archive, is stark. House in decline, family fearful, children pale, sounds persistent, he recommended. That the marshal advise evacuation. Wade hesitated, knowing such counsel would drive down the property's value and anger the land office. Meanwhile, local gossip tied the house to earlier disappearances. Stories resurfaced about Benjamin Kells, the settler recorded as vanishing in 1887. Some claimed he was a tinkerer, attempting to build machines that imitated the human form. Others said he was obsessed with sustaining breath in corpses, a rumor fed by scraps of paper found in the cellar. Though none of these tales were confirmed, they clung stubbornly, feeding the belief that the house was more than unlucky. It was cursed. Around this same time, articles about the Belvedere mansion in Claremore began circulating, describing its unfinished grandeur and strange echoes heard in its halls. Dr. Monroe herself compared notes with other physicians who had visited Claremore, remarking that certain buildings seemed to develop their own atmospheres, shaped as much by human fear as by architecture. She cautioned colleagues not to confuse folklore with pathology, yet her own letters admit, "The Harrow residence unsettled me in ways no patient ever has." By midsummer, the Harrows began speaking of leaving. They confided in friends that the house's breathing was louder in the heat, as though the boards inhaled with the sun and exhaled by night. Their farm hands left one by one, until only Amos Thorne remained, loyal but visibly shaken. Then, in August, came the first disappearance. A neighbor's daughter, only 13, vanished while walking the fence line that bordered the Harrow land. A search party scoured the fields. No trace was found, except for a ribbon lodged in the cellar doors. The official record lists her as missing, presumed runaway, but among townsfolk, the story took hold. The house had taken its first victim since the Harrows arrived. The disappearance of young Clara Bell, the neighbor's daughter, cast a shadow over the entire settlement. Though the sheriff's men searched miles of prairie, there were no footprints leading away, no wagon tracks, no sign of struggle. Only that ribbon, wedged in the cellar doors as though caught in some inhaling draught. Rumors spread quickly. In taverns and schoolhouses, people whispered that the house had drawn her in. Families began refusing to let their children anywhere near the Harrow property. Within a week, the Harrows themselves found their wagons smeared with coal tar and a message scrawled in chalk: "Leave while you can." Marshal Wade returned under pressure from the county. This time he brought more men, determined to conduct a thorough survey. They entered the cellar again, uncovering fresh disturbances in the soil. Spades revealed shallow depressions that looked too deliberate to be accidents. In one, they found the remains of a small animal, bones intact but oddly arranged, as though laid out in imitation of a rib cage. Wade recorded the finding in dry language, avoiding speculation, but his deputy scrawled privately, like lungs beneath the earth. The Harrows were questioned extensively. Mr. Harrow swore they had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, but suspicion lingered. A justice of the peace suggested charges, yet without evidence they could not proceed. What did persist, however, were the testimonies of those who claimed to hear sounds during the search. Several men swore the house itself let out a long, low moan when the cellar was dug. By September, the Harrow children had grown listless, pale, and fearful. One boy told a neighbor that he awoke at night to find his bedclothes sucked against my chest, as if the air itself tried to draw the breath from him. The mother confided in her letters that her hair had begun to fall in patches. She blamed on nerves, but described as worsening since the day of Clara's disappearance. Meanwhile, Dr. Monroe kept corresponding with colleagues in Claremore, again referencing the Belvedere mansion. She noted similarities, families reporting pressure, whispers, and oppressive drafts. She began to argue that certain houses might act as resonators of grief, though her peers criticized the phrase as too poetic. Still, she admitted that rational explanations, poor ventilation, structural shifts, did not fully account for the rhythmic, lung-like cadence reported. As autumn approached, matters escalated. A hired hand from a neighboring farm, sent to deliver supplies, never returned. His horse was found grazing half a mile from the Harrowland, reins trailing. In the saddlebag lay a receipt, signed at the Harrows' door. Beyond that, nothing. Fear spread wider now, tinged with anger. Locals accused the Harrows of harboring something unholy. At a town meeting, a rancher shouted, "That house breathes men and women away." Others argued for burning it down. Yet the sheriff warned against mob action, insisting the law must proceed by evidence. The Harrows themselves begged for release. Mr. Harrow petitioned the county to annul his deed, but officials delayed, wary of acknowledging such an unusual precedent. In the meantime, the family remained trapped between a house they feared and a town that now saw them as accomplices to its curse. The tension reached its peak in late October, when the house's reputation turned deadly once more. This time it was Amos Thorne, the one man who had stood by the Harrows from the start. The disappearance of Amos Thorne is one of the few events for which multiple consistent testimonies exist. According to Mrs. Harrow's later statement, Amos had grown increasingly restless after the loss of the neighbor's daughter. He complained of hearing sighs in his sleep, as though the rafters kept him awake with their own lungs. Yet he remained loyal, tending to chores the family no longer dared to complete. On the evening of October 21st, he was seen entering the cellar with a lantern. He told Mr. Harrow he intended to check the foundation stones, fearing rot. An hour passed, and when he did not return, Mr. Harrow went looking. The lantern was found smashed on the earthen floor, the flame extinguished. The cellar, though searched thoroughly, yielded no trace of Amos. By morning, word spread to Newkirk. A group of men arrived to scour the property, pulling up floorboards and probing soil with iron rods. They found nothing. A report filed by Marshal Wade is careful in its phrasing. Subject last seen alive within cellar. Subsequent absence unexplained. No sign of departure from premises. The townsfolk drew their own conclusions. To them, the house had claimed another victim. One man swore he saw dust falling from the rafters in slow rhythm, as if the structure exhaled relief at being fed. Another claimed the cellar doors moved on their own, opening wider as the search dragged on. This incident broke the Harrows. They declared they would leave by month's end, no matter what the county decided. Mrs. Harrow, according to a surviving letter, wrote, "It breathes louder now, louder with each loss. I fear for my children, most of all." But their departure never came smoothly. Local hostility boiled over. Farmers whispered that the Harrows had drawn this curse upon the land, or worse, that they had struck bargains with forces better left unnamed. By November, someone had set fire to their barn. No culprit was ever identified. Dr. Monroe visited one last time before the family fled. She recorded that the atmosphere of the house was thicker than before, her instruments noting measurable pressure changes, though she admitted these alone did not explain the strange cadence heard by all present. She compared the phenomenon again to the reports from Claremore's Belvedere mansion, remarking that while the mansion's accounts centered on shadows and creaks, the Harrow house seemed defined by respiration. "It is as though this structure mimics the body," she wrote, "whether by design, defect, or delusion." Shortly after, the Harrows abandoned the property. They left furniture, tools, even personal trunks, taking only what could be loaded quickly onto a wagon. Their exit was recorded in county notes as voluntary surrender of claim, yet their suddenness suggested terror more than choice. For a time, the house stood vacant again. Locals avoided it, but children dared one another to approach. One boy later testified decades later that he placed his ear against the siding and heard the whole wall inhale beneath my cheek. The legend might have ended there, had not scavengers entered the property in the spring of 1905 and made a discovery in the cellar soil. What they unearthed reignited both fear and speculation. In March of 1905, a trio of scavengers, two brothers named Callum and Jeb Rains, along with a drifter known only as Haskell, entered the abandoned Harrow property in search of valuables. According to later depositions, they pried open the cellar doors in daylight and began digging in the soil where Amos Thorne had last been seen. What they found was not treasure, but fragments that would deepen the mystery. Their spades struck wood, not in the form of a coffin, but crude planks hammered together into a shallow box. Inside were bones. At first they assumed animal remains, but the skull, though cracked, was unmistakably human. Jeb Rains swore under oath that the bones were arranged oddly, long bones laid to either side, ribs stacked together like lattice. "It was like somebody tried to build lungs from what they had," he later told the county clerk. The men reported their find reluctantly, fearing implication in grave robbing. Yet when Marshal Wade returned to examine the cellar, he confirmed the bones were human, though badly disturbed. No name could be attached to them, but whispers immediately returned to Benjamin Kells, the settler lost nearly 2 decades earlier. Others speculated it was Clara Bell, or even Amos himself, though the remains seemed too degraded for such recent disappearances. A physician called in from Arkansas City examined the bones and offered a cautious assessment. Multiple individuals might be represented, fragments mingled together without clear burial order. He noted strange attention to symmetry, as if someone had tried to reconstruct anatomy rather than simply dispose of it. His report, preserved in county records, ends abruptly with the line, "Whoever did this had an uncommon fixation on the act of breathing." The discovery reawakened the town's fears. Farmers demanded the house be destroyed, though legal ownership was tied up in dispute. It was after the Harrows fled. The county hesitated, unwilling to spend resources on demolition. Thus, the house remained standing, its reputation swelling with every retold story. By summer, Travelers passing along the road wrote of hearing exhalations as they neared the property. A salesman, in a letter to his wife, described the sensation as riding past the lungs of a giant creature, unseen but pressing in every direction. Even Marshall Wade began to falter in his official tone. In his private notebook, discovered years later among his family's effects, he admitted, "I cannot rid my ears of it. The walls heave in silence. It is not imagination." Local clergy argued over whether the house represented a spiritual blight or human crime. Reverend Bixby called it a habitation of sorrow that must be sealed. Yet no action was taken beyond boarding windows and nailing the cellar shut. Through it all, comparisons to Claremore's Belvedere mansion continued. Articles from the early 1900s noted how both properties attracted gossip of hauntings, though the Belvedere was still inhabited by prominent families. The Harrow house, by contrast, was left to rot. Dr. Monroe wrote to a colleague, "The Claremore estate unsettles by grandeur. The Harrow residence unsettles by breath." The final recorded event of that year would further darken its legacy. Reports of figures seen walking inside the empty house at night, moving from room to room with lanterns that no one carried. By autumn of 1905, the Harrow property had taken on a new role. It was no longer a homestead, but a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the reckless. Teenagers dared each other to approach the fence, wander the porch, or knock on the cellar doors. Some returned laughing, but others came back pale, swearing they heard a sound not unlike someone struggling to breathe beneath the floor. A deputy sheriff named Callahan documented 2 such reports in September. He wrote, "Boys claimed lights moved room to room, though house vacant. I entered, saw dust fall in steady rhythm from ceiling boards, felt no wind, heard only my own breath, yet not mine alone." The persistence of these tales forced the county to post notices discouraging trespass. Yet warnings only heightened interest. Drifters, scavengers, and those drawn by morbid curiosity kept returning. A schoolteacher who ventured in described finding children's chalk drawings on the parlor wall, lines resembling lungs, ribs, and stick figures caught in between. Whether these were old or newly scrawled remained unclear. Meanwhile, legal matters around the house became more entangled. The Harrows, living under assumed names in Kansas, refused to reclaim ownership. Neighbors refused to buy the parcel, even at reduced price. County officials argued over responsibility, and the house remained in limbo, a place no one wanted, but everyone talked about. That winter, another disappearance rekindled the community's anger. A young ranch hand, William Coe, vanished after boasting he would spend a night in the breathing house to prove it harmless. His friends waited for him outside, but by dawn he was gone. They swore they heard muffled noises within, but dared not enter until daylight. When they did, they found only his hat in the upstairs hall, dust pressed into its brim as though from a heavy sigh. The sheriff's report lists him as missing, presumed runaway. But townsfolk knew better. It was said the house claimed those who mocked it. Letters from Dr. Monroe in early 1906 suggest she wrestled deeply with the case. She admitted that physiological terms, inhale, exhale, were used repeatedly in testimonies, and she could not dismiss the consistency. She speculated whether certain structural features might amplify underground drafts, creating a rhythm. Yet even she confessed the effect was too deliberate, too steady. "The house acts as a body," she wrote, though no blueprint accounts for it. At the same time, reports from Claremore about the Belvedere mansion's spectral reputation continued circulating in newspapers, adding weight to the notion that Oklahoma's newer estates carried old ghosts of their own. Monroe herself referenced it again. "Claremore is strange by echo, Kay County by breath." With multiple vanishings now tied to the house, talk of torching it grew louder. Some argued that only fire would erase its influence. Yet others feared that burning might release what it held. The county stalled, caught between law and legend. Through 1906, the property stood sealed but restless. Trespassers kept testing the doors, reporting a faint thrum in the boards when pressed, like the beat of a living heart. By then, locals had stopped calling it The Harrow place. It had a new name, spoken in whispers. The Breathing House. By the spring of 1906, the name Breathing House had spread beyond Kay County. Travelers from Arkansas and Kansas claimed they had heard of it in saloons, where the tale was told as a cautionary story. Some exaggerated, describing walls that groaned aloud, others insisting the house inhaled smoke from campfires set nearby. While details varied, the reputation remained steady. This was a place that consumed. That same year, a group of railway workers passing through Newkirk stopped to see the house for themselves. One of them, a man named Jasper Doyle, later gave a statement to a clerk. He described entering the front hall and feeling his shirt cling to his chest. "It was like something pulling the air out of me," he wrote. His companion, less shaken, laughed it off, claiming Doyle had panicked in a stale house. But Doyle swore he never felt such pressure anywhere else. His words were copied into local records by request, though officials refused to label them more than anecdote. Meanwhile, scavengers continued to disturb the cellar. Another box of bones was uncovered, these arranged with a peculiar precision, ribs lined neatly, vertebrae stacked like a column. Dr. Monroe examined them and noted in her report, "No burial rite, rather an attempt to simulate form, the work of one compelled by breath and body, not by reverence." She questioned aloud whether Benjamin Kells, long missing, might have conducted experiments there, though she emphasized that no evidence proved it. Rumors connected these fragments to Clara Bell, the missing girl, and to Amos Thorne, though the degradation of the remains suggested earlier deaths. Some whispered the house fed itself on those who vanished, leaving only bones rearranged in imitation of lungs. By late summer, fear again turned violent. A group of locals attempted to set fire to the house, but the blaze sputtered. Witnesses clayed. The flame seemed to bend inward, drawn into the walls before dying out. The men fled, shaken, and later denied involvement. County officials debated demolishing the structure altogether, but funds were scarce, and arguments persisted over legal liability. For now, they nailed the cellar shut again and posted new notices. Still, those who ventured close swore they could hear a muffled pulse behind the boards. In nearby Claremore, the Belvedere Mansion continued attracting its own legends, particularly after the death of its original builder's family. Articles comparing the two houses began to appear, grand versus humble, but both marked by sorrow. Some journalists suggested Oklahoma's land itself carried a restless quality, as if new settlements stood upon older, unsettled foundations. Through the end of 1906, the Breathing House remained a quiet but potent presence. No one lived there, yet its story lived more vibrantly than many homes full of life. And as winter came, the empty windows seemed to exhale steam on cold nights, though no fire burned inside. It was in this season that an itinerant photographer passing through Newkirk was persuaded to capture an image of the property. That photograph, though grainy and flawed, would itself become part of the legend. The photograph was taken in January of 1907 by a traveling photographer named Milton R. Stokes. His glass plate negative still exists in fragments, preserved in a private collection, though copies circulate among collectors of regional folklore. The image shows the house with its windows dark, roof sagging, and the cellar doors faintly ajar. What unsettled later viewers was the faint blur at the parlor window, described by some as a fog, by others as a figure with its mouth open. Stokes himself, in a note accompanying the photo, claimed the camera lens fogged only at that exposure. He had taken 3 other shots that day, none with blemish. "The house drew the breath from the glass," he wrote cryptically. Local newspapers did not print the photo, but word of its eerie qualities spread quickly. Soon it was being shown in taverns, fueling late-night arguments about whether the blur proved the house lived. By this time, the Harrows had long vanished into Kansas. Efforts to track them down produced only fragments: a bill of sale for a wagon, a letter with a Kansas City postmark, rumors they changed their name to Harris. Some speculated they wanted to erase all connection to the Breathing House, fearful it would follow them. Marshall Wade, still burdened by the case, resigned his post in mid-1907. His resignation letter cites personal strain, and unresolved matters. Privately, his family recalled him waking at night, gasping, muttering, "It's in my chest." His journals, what remain of them, show a man both determined to dismiss superstition and unable to free himself from its grip. Meanwhile, interest in haunted dwellings was growing. The Belvedere mansion in Claremore, completed only months earlier, began attracting whispers of its own. Its grandeur contrasted sharply with the Harrow property, but reports of strange noises and shadows seemed to echo the same themes. Readers in Oklahoma papers began drawing parallels, calling one a house of echoes, the other a house of breath. That summer, trespassers returned again and claimed to find the cellar disturbed. One scavenger said he heard a low, continuous hum from beneath the floor, like a body refusing to let go of air. He fled before investigating further. His statement survives only as a handwritten note filed with the county under miscellaneous. The structure itself, though decaying, seemed oddly intact compared to other abandoned farmhouses. Carpenters noted that the timbers had not buckled as expected. "It holds together as though it wills to," one remarked, "like a chest resisting collapse." Such comments only fueled belief that the house had a life of its own. By the close of 1907, the county again debated demolition. Funds were requested but never approved, and so the house endured into the next decade, abandoned but not forgotten, its story weaving deeper into Oklahoma's folklore. What came next was a series of fires, not of the house itself but of documents connected to it. In 1908, the courthouse in Newkirk suffered a small fire. Officially, the cause was listed as a faulty stove. The damage was contained, but among the records lost were several files connected to abandoned properties, including the Harrow deed and early reports on the Breathing House. Some believed it a coincidence, yet locals remarked it seemed the house resisted being catalogued. Later that same year, a second fire destroyed part of the office of the Newkirk Republican. Among the charred remains was the ledger containing clippings about Clara Bell's disappearance and the vanished ranch hand, William Coe. These stories survived only in scattered personal copies. Townsfolk whispered that the house burned its own story. By 1909, the property remained empty, but trespassers kept fueling its reputation. A group of young men dared one another to stay overnight. Only 2 lasted till morning. The third was found wandering a mile down the road at dawn, dazed and muttering. He insisted he could hear the house inhale and exhale in rhythm with his own chest until it nearly suffocated him. When pressed for details, he grew hysterical and never set foot near the property again. That same year, surveyors marking land boundaries refused to stay long on the site. One noted in his journal, "The compass wavers near the cellar. Air feels thicker, instruments unsteady." These technical remarks, though plain, were seized upon as proof that even professionals sensed something unnatural. Dr. Monroe, still corresponding with peers, attempted to frame the case in clinical terms. She argued that soil composition, underground cavities, and warped beams might create rhythmic drafts mistaken for breath. Yet she admitted that no other dwelling had produced such consistent testimony across so many unrelated witnesses. She compared it once more to the Belvedere mansion in Claremore, noting that the disappearance of 1911 was different, for it involved not a child or hired hand, but a man of standing, Professor Charles Henley of Guthrie, an amateur historian with ties to the Territorial University, traveled north to document local folklore. He had heard repeated tales of the Breathing House and sought to examine it himself, bringing along sketchbooks and a phonograph cylinder for notes. Henley was meticulous, leaving a trail of correspondence before arriving. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The consistency of reports intrigues me. So many speak of respiration, inhale, exhale, as if the dwelling were alive. I intend to test the claim directly." He entered the house in May of that year. 2 locals accompanied him but remained on the porch. According to their statements, Henley descended into the cellar alone, setting up his recording equipment. After an hour, they heard the scratch of the phonograph needle, followed by faint wheezing sounds. Assuming the machine had malfunctioned, they waited. When Henley did not emerge, They called for him. No reply came. By dusk, they searched. The cellar was empty. His equipment remained, cylinder spinning, recording nothing but static. His notes, scattered nearby, ended mid-sentence. The rhythm is not of timber alone, but... And then trailed into a scrawl. Henley was never seen again. His disappearance caused a stir far beyond Kay County, reported in Guthrie, and even in Kansas City papers. Scholars debated whether he had staged his own vanishing to build notoriety. Yet his family insisted he had no such intentions. The phonograph cylinder was preserved. When replayed, it contained several minutes of silence, followed by a low, drawn-out sound resembling a sigh. Skeptics argued it was mere wind. Others claimed it was too steady, too human. The incident gave the house a new notoriety, no longer merely a rural curiosity. It became a subject of academic gossip. Some whispered Henley had been swallowed by the structure itself. Others said his research threatened to expose something better left buried. Dr. Monroe, by then older and more cautious, remarked privately that Henley's case reminded her of Claremore's Belvedere Mansion, where stories of vanished guests and uneasy echoes were already circulating. Perhaps certain dwellings invite their own narratives, she wrote, but some narratives refuse to end. After Henley's disappearance, county officials once again pressed for the house's demolition, but the funds were never allocated. Instead, the house remained standing, boarded tighter, a place now regarded with fear by nearly everyone who lived within a day's ride. Still, it drew the curious. Travelers, riders, and wanderers passed through, some leaving with stories of groaning timbers, others shaken by silence itself. Each left behind fragments, letters, notes, recollections that would later form the patchwork case file we know today. And while 1911 marked the last officially recorded disappearance, the legend did not rest. In the years that followed, echoes of the breathing house continued to ripple outward, whispered across Oklahoma like a secret exhale carried on the wind. By the 1910s, the breathing house was no longer just a local blight, but a legend carried across Oklahoma territory and into the new state. Farmers still avoided the property, but journalists and amateur investigators kept it alive in print. Short pieces appeared in regional newspapers, half folklore, half cautionary tale, always mentioning the disappearances, always returning to the strange notion of a house that drew breath. Survivors of earlier encounters occasionally gave testimony. One rancher recalled leading cattle past the fence. The beasts stopped and would not budge, though no predator was near. Their sides heaved as if something pulled their breath away. His affidavit, recorded in 1913, was dismissed by officials but preserved in private collections. The house itself weathered strangely. By all accounts, it should have collapsed under neglect, yet it held its frame. Carpentry experts who surveyed the building around 1914 remarked that the timbers seemed resistant to rot, as though sealed from within. It stands as a chest pressed tight, one wrote. The phrase only added fuel to the legend. In these years, parallels to Claremore's Belvedere Mansion continued to appear in print. The mansion's history of family misfortune and whispered hauntings made for an easy comparison. Writers argued that both sites embodied Oklahoma's uneasy transition from frontier to statehood, a reminder that progress sometimes rested on unsettled ground. Folklore spread beyond the region. Collections of American ghost stories began, including a version of the breathing house, usually altered. Sometimes it inhaled travelers whole, sometimes it whispered names through the walls. Yet even distorted, the core idea endured, that a house could live. Meanwhile, locals reported hearing sounds even when no one entered. A mail carrier passing by in 1915 wrote to his supervisor, "The house lets out a moan when storms gather, like lungs tightening before rain." His letter is preserved in postal archives. By the late decade, the house had become a place of pilgrimage for the curious. Motorists, part of a new era of travel, began to stop by. Some left graffiti carved into the boards, initials, dates, crude drawings of lungs. These markings, still noted in later surveys, mingled with the house's own scars. County records show repeated discussions of demolition, but never action. Some argued the cost was too high. Others feared drawing the curse upon themselves. And so, year by year, the house endured, abandoned, yet never forgotten. Those who lived nearby claimed it still breathed. They said its sighs carried across the fields at night, a reminder that though empty, it was not silent. The next major event came not from disappearance, but from attempted study, when a group of college students from Oklahoma City ventured north in 1917, bringing notebooks and bravado. In the summer of 1917, a group of 4 university students from Oklahoma City set out to investigate the Breathing House. They were part of a folklore club, eager to document tales of the frontier before they slipped away. Armed with notebooks, a borrowed camera, and youthful bravado, they believed they could reduce the legend to mere superstition. The group camped on the edge of the property for 2 nights. Their journals, preserved in fragments, describe an initial sense of anticlimax. No sounds, no movements, only an empty and weathered house. On the 3rd night, however, one of them, a student named Richard Lane, recorded in his notebook, "We heard it, a long inhale, so faint we thought it wind, but then it paused and returned, measured, as if a chest took breath. The others looked at me at once. None laughed. They entered the house before dawn, camera ready. Inside, the boards creaked but did not collapse. Dust lay heavy, yet the air felt strangely damp, as though newly exhaled. They photographed the parlor and cellar, though the plates later developed showed only blurred interiors. One student, Margaret Ellis, claimed she felt her skirt pulled against her legs, as though air was rushing past. In her letter home she wrote, "It was not draft, but suction, as though the walls drew me inward." She refused to enter again. By morning, the group left shaken. Their report, presented later to their professor, concluded cautiously. Whether by structure, soil, or superstition, the property sustains the impression of respiration. They never returned, but their visit kept the story alive in academic circles. Around this time, stories from Claremore's Belvedere Mansion also resurfaced in Oklahoma papers, comparing the grandeur of one haunted site with the ruin of another. Journalists drew parallels between echoes in Claremore's halls and the breaths of Kay County's lones. Battley Farmhouse, suggesting both represented the unsettled soul of a new state. Meanwhile, locals continued to speak of the house as if it were an unwelcome neighbor. A farmer claimed his daughter woke screaming after dreaming of the house leaning down to inhale her. A midwife swore that laboring mothers nearby always struggled to catch their breath. These anecdotes, though unverifiable, became part of the oral tradition. By 1918, as the world focused on war overseas and influenza at home, attention to the Breathing House waned. Yet for those who lived within earshot, the legend did not rest. Some said the house grew louder in those years, as if feeding on the grief and gasps of a state overwhelmed by loss. And though no new vanishings were recorded, its reputation as a place where air itself was untrustworthy endured. The next chapter would come decades later, when researchers and wanderers of a new era rediscovered what remained. By the 1920s, the Breathing House had already slipped into legend, yet it still stood, weather-beaten but uncollapsed. Farmers near Kay County spoke of it only when pressed. Children repeated the stories in schoolyards, daring one another to touch the fence posts or throw stones at the shutters. The adults, meanwhile, treated the place as a wound best left closed. During this decade, Oklahoma newspapers occasionally revisited the tale, often lumping it with other stories of regional hauntings. A 1924 column in the Guthrie Daily Leader described it as that northern ruin where the walls heave like lungs. The writer dismissed the claims as frontier superstition, but admitted the house's survival was remarkable in itself. Photographs from this period show the roof sagging further, weeds high against the porch, and cellar doors warped but still intact. Strangely, the central frame held firm. A carpenter hired briefly by the county in 1926 remarked, "Timber this old should crack, but here it flexes like ribs." His casual words only deepened the unease. Folklore researchers began cataloging testimonies. They noted the consistency of descriptions: inhaling, exhaling, sighing, pressure against the chest. Some drew comparisons to the Belvedere Mansion in Claremore, still occupied but long rumored to echo with tragedy. "One grand, one ruined," wrote a folklorist, "yet both alive in ways we do not understand." Through the 1930s, the Great Depression overshadowed local legends. Families struggled, farms failed, and attention drifted elsewhere. Yet the house remained. Travelers seeking work often camped nearby, sometimes wandering inside. A diary from a migrant worker in 1933 describes waking in the parlor with dust rising and falling as though stirred by a sleeping giant. He fled before dawn, leaving behind his bedroll. In 1937, a Works Progress Administration surveyor visited the property. His report, intended to be mundane, described irregular air drafts, rhythmic and sustained. The notes were filed away, nearly forgotten until rediscovered decades later by historians. Locals whispered that the house breathed louder during storms, when wind pressed across the plains. Some claimed it even exhaled during dust storms, sending choking grit into the air. While no one could prove such claims, the imagery was enough to keep the legend alive. By the 1940s, time finally began to collapse parts of the roof, yet the central frame still resisted. Veterans returning from war heard the story anew, and some went to see for themselves. One soldier, hardened by Europe, later said, "I never flinched in battle, but when that place sighed, I stepped back." The house had become a relic, both forgotten and unforgettable, a ruin that refused to end. By the 1950s, the Breathing House was little more than a ruin on county maps, yet its reputation endured in whispers. The land had changed hands multiple times, though no owner ever stayed long. Tax records show brief claims, names appearing one year, disappearing the next, as if the property itself refused permanence. Travel was easier now, and motorists passing through northern Oklahoma often sought out the site. Some treated it as a roadside curiosity, snapping photographs of its collapsing roof. Others swore they left with more than memories. A family from Wichita claimed their car stalled as they passed, the engine refusing to turn until they pushed it beyond sight of the house. In their statement to a local mechanic, they described hearing a long sigh in the wind just before the failure. Folklore collectors in the 1950s recorded multiple accounts from older residents. One farmer, by then in his 70s, said, "I never saw it take a soul, but I heard it. It draws breath when you stand near. You feel it in your shirt, in your bones. I kept my cattle wide from it." His words echoed nearly identical phrases from testimony half a century earlier. Paranormal groups, though not yet common, occasionally wrote letters to county offices asking permission to investigate. These were almost always denied. Still, trespassers continued to enter. Some reported that the cellar air felt damp, as if the earth itself was sweating. One young man described dust moving in and out, like lungs inflating. He fled and never returned. In 1958, a small article in the Daily Oklahoman revisited both the Breathing House and Claremore's Belvedere Mansion, presenting them as Oklahoma's two strangest dwellings. The Belvedere was described as elegant but haunted by shadows, while the Kay County ruin was called the house that will not let the air be still. The comparison tied the two together once again, cementing the Harrow place in state folklore. By the 1960s, the house was collapsing more visibly, but the cellar remained intact. Local children claimed to hear moans from beneath the rubble, and teenagers carved graffiti into what boards were left. One inscription, found years later, read simply, "It still breathes." The county debated clearing the ruins, but funds were scarce and interest minimal. In the end, the structure remained, its legend growing older but never fading. And though decades had passed since the last recorded disappearance, the whispers around Kay County insisted that the house was not done, that it inhaled still, waiting for another. By the 1970s, the Breathing House had become more ruin than home, its frame sagging into the earth, Yet the cellar remained, half hidden by weeds and warped boards. Locals rarely spoke of it, but stories lingered. Hunters passing through claimed they heard sighs rising with the mist at dawn. A mail carrier swore that letters carried past the site were damp, as though exposed to condensation from an unseen breath. Folklorists revisiting the case during this period often dismissed the stories as the product of rural isolation. Still, their field notes betray unease. One graduate student from Norman recorded, "When standing inside, all noise fell away, but my own breathing, until I realized the rhythm no longer matched mine." He never published his findings, but his private diary was later discovered among estate papers. The 1970s also saw a revival of local legends, spurred by television programs about hauntings across America. The Breathing House appeared briefly in a segment about Oklahoma folklore, described as a ruin that sighs with lungs long gone. Though brief, the exposure ensured a new generation heard the tale. Some believed the house fed on attention. When ignored, it fell silent. When remembered, it stirred. Farmers nearby insisted that every time an article or program mentioned it, cattle once again shied from the fence line. Meanwhile, Claremore's Belvedere Mansion was being restored as a historic site, its haunted reputation leveraged for tourism. The contrast was stark. One mansion, celebrated despite whispers, the other ruin avoided, though abandoned. Yet both, in the minds of many Oklahomans, were bound by the same invisible thread, a reminder that not all buildings rest quietly. By the late 1970s, vandalism had further damaged the ruin. Teenagers stripped boards, spray-painted walls, and broke what glass remained. Yet some left shaken. One young woman claimed she heard her own name whispered from the cellar. Her friends laughed, but she refused to return. County officials finally moved to fence the site, citing liability. But fencing did little to dispel the legend. If anything, it marked the property as dangerous, fueling the very curiosity it sought to discourage. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Breathing House was scarcely more than skeletal beams and a cellar door that still seemed to shift with every season. Yet locals swore the ruin persisted because it refused to collapse entirely. And so, even in near death, it was said to breathe. By the 1990s, little remained of the Breathing House but a foundation of stone, fragments of timber, and the half-buried cellar. The walls had finally collapsed, but those who lived nearby insisted the ruin still carried its rhythm. Farmers told of passing on still nights and hearing what sounded like lungs drawing air through broken boards. Children dared each other to lay an ear against the fence posts, swearing they could hear sighs rise from the ground itself. Local historians occasionally revisited the case, piecing together fragments from courthouse records, lost clippings, and the scattered testimonies of those who once lived near. Each account differed in detail, but repeated the same words: inhale, exhale, sigh, breath, a consistency across decades too stubborn to ignore. In one reflection published in the early 2000s, a professor noted that Oklahoma seemed to carry two enduring legends of haunted dwellings: Claremore's Belvedere Mansion, restored to grandeur, and the Breathing House of Kay County, left to decay. One celebrated its ghosts, the other concealed its lungs. Yet both, he argued, spoke to the unease of a young state built on unsettled ground. Today the site is fenced, marked as dangerous, but hikers still wander close. Some claim to feel pressure in their chests, as though the air thickened without cause. Others swear they've heard whispers rising with the wind, or seen dust pulse in steady rhythm. None of it has been proven, yet none of it has been disproven either. The cellar remains sealed, overgrown by weeds and shadow. No marker tells its story, and no plaque lists the names of those said to have vanished there. What endures is only a legend, a ruin remembered not for what stood, but for what it seemed to do. Even now, locals say, when the storms gather on the Oklahoma plain, the air across the empty lot will shift in rhythm, rising and fall, ling like lungs unseen, and those who dare to listen swear they can still hear it, the long, steady breath of a house that refuses to die.